morning. Sorry, good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Dr. Steph Kershaw, and I'm a postdoctoral research fellow at the Matilda Centre for Research in Mental Health and Substance Use, which is located at the University of Sydney. And I'm also the project coordinator for the Cracks in the Ice online toolkit. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar. Before we begin our webinar, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, water and culture. I'm currently on the land of the Kaurna people in South Australia, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. And I'd also like to further acknowledge the traditional owners of the country on which you are on and pay respects to their elders past, present and future. So today's presentation is one in a series of webinars which is focused around crystal methamphetamine and the Australian community. And before I introduce today's speaker, I just want to let you know a few housekeeping things. So as participants, you are in listen only mode, and that means that we can't see or hear you. However, you will notice that there's a Q&A button on your dashboard. And this is where you can type in any questions that you have during the webinar, or if you're having any difficulties, and we will get back to you. We'll also be having a question and answer session at the end of the presentation. So if you think of any questions while our presenter is speaking, please send them through. I'd also like to let you know that we will be recording the session today and making the recording as well as the slides available to you through the Cracks in the Ice website. So it's my great pleasure to introduce you to our presenter for today, Dr. Christopher Hunt. So Dr. Hunt is a clinical psychologist who is the Senior Supervisor at the Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic at the University of Sydney. And Dr. Hunt has been working at the clinic for 12 years and has experience with a range of different psychological therapies for problem gambling. He's also published work on gambling as well as on issues of gender roles and body image. So thank you so much for joining us today, Dr. Hunt. We're really pleased to have you with us, and I'm sure it's going to be an interesting session talking about problem gambling and stimulant use. So I'm just going to stop sharing my screen now and hand over to you to make the presentation.
Oh, thanks for the introduction, Steph. And yeah, thank you for having me today. So I'm just going to share my slides, so hopefully everyone can see those.
Yep. Looks good.
All right, so I know the focus of this seminar series has been specifically on crystal methamphetamine use. I'm probably going to talk, when I do talk about drugs, I'll probably talk a little bit more broadly it's problem gambling and stimulant use that I'm talking about today. Just because in the sphere of problem gambling, a lot of the issues that we see with ice and other forms of methamphetamine are very similar to the issues we also see with cocaine use. So I'm sort of talking about the two of them together today. But generally speaking, I'm not an expert necessarily in drug use and treatment for drugs. My expertise is in gambling, so I will be talking primarily about gambling and then giving some ideas about how these two areas can overlap. So just to give a bit of a background, so the University of Sydney Gambling Treatment and Research Clinic, so we were founded in 1999, so over 20 years ago, and we are funded by the New South Wales Office of Responsible Gambling. So essentially this body, they're an independent body that takes 2% of the casino's turnover and uses it to fund problem gambling treatment and research. So we have locations in Camperdown, Parramatta and Campbelltown. So for those of you from outside of the Sydney region, that includes inner city and outer city areas. So we have quite a broad demographic range of clients that we see. And at this point, we've provided treatment to over 5,000 clients. The clients present with difficulties related to a range of gambling types. So still primarily the most common form of gambling that we see are people who gamble on what are technically called electronic gaming machines or pokies. So probably about 50% of our clients primarily gamble on pokies. The next biggest group is wagering. So probably about 40% of our clients gamble on wagering, so racing and sports betting. So when I started in the clinic 12 years ago, that group was almost all racing. Now it is moving a lot more to sports betting, but they do have a lot of similarities. The next 10%, most of them are casino table games, which is usually baccarat, roulette, or blackjack. We do get small numbers of people that play poker or lottery products, but they're sort of few and far between. So the majority are pokies or horses and sports. So what is problem gambling? So it's a really broad term, but generally speaking, the focus is on the harm that gambling causes rather than any specific diagnosis or symptoms. So the formal definition of it is problem gambling, sorry, bad grammar there. Problem gambling is characterized by difficulties in limiting money and or time spent gambling, which leads to adverse consequences for the gambler, for others, or for the community as a whole. So the focus is very much on the harm that gambling is causing rather than the behavior specifically. So the most common harm seen, first of all, is financial, as you probably obviously guess. So the financial harms to do with gambling tend to be the primary harms that you see. Now, as a clinic, we have done various research projects that have looked at this, and what we've found is that the financial harms usually come first, and the other harms are usually secondary to the financial harms. So people who have access to large amounts of money, who have large incomes or large amounts of savings, they tend to experience less of the other harms of gambling because they're experiencing less financial distress as a result of their gambling. So the next most common harms are relationships. So that includes with romantic partners as well as with parents, children, friends. Occupational or educational problems. So that can be things like missing days at work because you don't have enough money to get there. It can be being distracted at work or at school or university because you're thinking about or worried about your gambling. It can be not being able to pay for school supplies or university supplies if you're talking about educational problems. So that's the sort of things that we would see in that group. Psychological issues, so anxiety and depression are very common in people with a gambling problem. Generally speaking, in the majority of our clients, the anxiety and the depression are secondary to the gambling. So usually their gambling comes first, and then following that, we start to see anxiety and depression symptoms. Although there is a small group for whom the depression and or anxiety predates the gambling. We also see forensic issues. So in 5 to 10% of people who have a gambling problem, we do see criminal acts. The most common are things like theft, fraud, embezzlement. I know before I started working in the gambling clinic, I'd never heard of the term obtaining financial advantage via deception, but that's probably by far the most common crime that we see in our clients. But yeah, it is a minority, but it is a significant minority. So 5 to 10% probably is, you know, maybe smaller than what you'd see in a drug treatment clinic, but it's definitely more than what you would see in a generalist treatment clinic for psychological services. Thoughts of suicide are actually extremely common in problem gamblers. So recent statistics suggest that problem gamblers are 13 times more likely to have thoughts of suicide than the general population. It's debatable as to whether or not suicidal acts are more common, but definitely thoughts of suicide are incredibly common in problem gamblers. When we talk about formal diagnoses, however, so you know, for those of you who are not from psychological backgrounds, there is a book called the DSM, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of the American Psychiatric Society, which is used to provide psychiatric diagnoses. Up until recently, there was a diagnosis of pathological gambling that was included. And until recently, it was included under impulse control disorders. So it was included with things like trichotillomania, which is pulling out your hair, or kleptomania, which is starting fires. Now, the criteria for this disorder were modeled off drug and alcohol disorders. So basically, they took the criteria for drug and alcohol disorders, crossed out drinking or taking drugs, wrote in gambling, and reused them, as well as adding a few ones which are quite specific to gambling. Now, in DSM-5, the latest edition, which came out in 2013, they changed the name from pathological gambling to gambling disorder, which was seen as less stigmatizing. And they moved the disorder into a new category called non-substance addiction. So moving from that previous grouping that I mentioned before. And it currently is the only recognized disorder in that category. So it's the only currently recognized non-substance related addiction. These are the criteria that we do see. So they need to meet 4 or more in a 12-month period. So as I mentioned before, the first couple are ones that are very similar to what you would see in drug and alcohol disorders. So tolerance, withdrawal, repeated unsuccessful efforts to stop gambling, preoccupation with gambling, so thinking about it constantly, often gambles as a way of relieving distress. The next one, chasing, is something that is very specific to gambling. So what that means is after you've lost money, returning the next day to try and win some of that back. Lies to try and conceal the involvement with gambling, impacts on relationships, careers, or education. And this other one, I guess, is very specific to gambling, is relying on others to provide money to bail out from gambling losses. So it's very common. We also see a lot of family members and friends of problem gamblers in our clinic, and probably the #1 question that they ask us is, should I be giving them money? I've been giving them cash to pay for this, this, and this. Is that the right thing to do? So it's an extremely common thing that you see in problem gambling. The next criteria is that the behavior is not better explained by a manic episode. So if someone has bipolar disorder and are gambling, it's really important to determine if they're only doing it when they're in a manic stage or if they're doing it generally. And it's something I'll come back to when I talk about drugs to do with gambling. But it's basically, the idea is if someone is in a manic state, they have less ability to see the consequences of their actions, and therefore you wouldn't consider them to have a gambling problem. But if they gamble when they're depressed, then you would consider them to have a gambling problem. Now, this idea of gambling as an addiction. So problematic gambling is increasingly being seen through this lens, that gambling is an addiction. As I said, the criteria for gambling disorders was explicitly modeled from that of drug and alcohol. And it's not just gambling that's being viewed through this lens. So we're also seeing other behaviors. So compulsive sexual behavior, compulsive shopping, gaming, so like in terms of video games, is also now being viewed in this behavioral addiction lens. As I mentioned before, gambling is at this moment the only one that's officially recognized. But generally speaking, we are seeing this narrative, not just in the scientific literature, but also it's quite common in lay literature, in the newspapers and magazines, to hear about these behavioral addictions. However, at our clinic, we have a long history of rejecting this addiction model for gambling. Now, the founding clinic director, Michael Walker, who unfortunately has passed away now, but he wrote extensively on what he saw as the differences between gambling and substance use disorders. Now, one of the analogies that I like to use is, it's like comparing an echidna to a porcupine. So when you look at them from the outside, they look kind of similar. They're these small sort of spiky creatures that scurry around on the ground and eat ants. But actually, when you look inside them, they're very different. Now, primarily that reason is because echidnas lay eggs, whereas a porcupine gives birth to live young. So how they reproduce and the impact that has on their body is very different. So that's sort of similarly how I would explain gambling and drugs and alcohol. They may have some superficial similarities, but they're actually quite different. So the key argument that Michael Walker made is that tolerance and withdrawal are these very central ideas when we're talking about substance use disorders. And while we see tolerance and withdrawal-like symptoms in gambling, they're very different to what we see in drugs and alcohol. So the tolerance, so the increasing sums of money that we see in gambling, they generally speaking aren't increasing the sums of money they're gambling to increase their excitement or increasing the effect of their gambling. They're increasing their bet size primarily because they're trying to win back what they've lost. So the mechanism by which their bets get bigger is quite different. Similarly, with withdrawal, and this is really an interesting time to talk about this, when we were in the lockdown and all the gambling venues were shut, people didn't report experiencing withdrawal-like symptoms. Gamblers, when they can't gamble, when their money is taken away or when their gambling options are shut off, report experiencing a sense of relief. they just don't think about it. It doesn't even cross into their minds. If they don't have the money or the opportunity, it's almost like gambling doesn't exist for them anymore. Whereas obviously with drugs and alcohol, the withdrawal symptoms can be quite severe. So, you know, there's a lot of physical consequences of abruptly withdrawing from a drug. You know, if we're talking about alcohol or benzodiazepines, you can see things like seizures. If we're talking about, say, opioids, you can get very serious diarrhea. You can also have vomiting, seizures, you know, things like that, aggression, irritability, shakes, all sorts of things that you see. Whereas with gamblers, it's almost like sometimes there's a mild irritation, but for most people, it's more a sense of relief. So our current clinic director, Alex Basinski, he has also written about this idea of behavioral addictions, essentially over-pathologizing everyday life through this concept. So on the left here, I've got examples of things that are often highlighted as behavioral addiction. So being on your mobile phone too much, you know, Facebook is addictive, the internet is addictive, sex is considered addictive, video games are considered addictive. But on the right, we have other behaviors which are also characterized by increasing time and money spent on them, that are also characterized by forgetting other activities because you're playing them, but we don't characterize them as addiction. So things like golf, playing a musical instrument, playing chess. Generally speaking, we don't think of them as addictions, and the distinction seems to be that the things on the left there are considered bad or morally wrong by society, whereas the things on the right are considered you know, good or positive activities. So, you know, this idea of behavioral addictions, it seems to be more of a moral lens that we're looking at things rather than a scientific lens that we're looking at things. Now, finally, Fadi Angel, who is our current clinic co-director, he has spent a lot of time thinking about gambling and developed new ways of treating gambling. And he highlights that the key difference between gambling and drug and alcohol issues is the bivariate nature of gambling. So what I mean by that is, with drugs and alcohol, someone's considering what activity they're going to engage in. They decide to take drugs and alcohol, and it produces a specific effect through the physiological effect of the drug entering the body. So for some, that's a stimulating effect for some drugs, and for some drugs, that's an anxiolytic effect. And then what happens is after the drug goes out of the system, we see withdrawal symptoms, and it's sort of this linear relationship that leads to then this cycle of the behavior continuing. Whereas gambling is a little bit different, because when you're deciding what to do and you decide to gamble, it's not the same. It's not a linear relationship, because anytime you place a bet, whether it's on the pokies, whether it's on the lotto, whether it's on the horses, one of two things can happen. You either win and you feel better, or you lose and you feel worse. So the key difference between drugs and alcohol and gambling is that with gambling, there's two different outcomes, and the different outcomes have different impacts on the individual. So in a sense, no one's really, even if we do use the term addiction, which, you know, I'm not really comfortable with using, but no one's actually addicted to gambling per se. People are addicted to the feeling that they get when they win. And the problem is that the majority of the time they don't actually win. So it is, you know, for example, when we're talking about drugs and alcohol, so with alcohol, most people would know that if I drink X amount, this is the effect it's going to have on me. If I drink more, it will have a greater effect on me. With gambling, it's unknown. It's unknown how many bets do I have to make that I'm going to get a win, which is going to make me feel better. So it's through that dichotomous nature of the variable that we see this key difference between drugs and alcohol and gambling. So when we think about gambling and substance stimulant use, combining this sort of theory with how gambling works, it sort of explains why these particular drugs are really important when we're thinking about gambling. So the central driver of problem gambling is what we call positive expectancy, which is basically this belief that if I was to gamble, I'm more likely to end the session being up than down. So even though most problem gamblers will tell you, oh, I know I'm going to lose, when they're there, when they're in front of that poker machine, when they're putting that bet on the horse, the expectation is always this bet is going to win. So even though they might know at a broader scale that they're going to lose, there's this positive expectancy that's really driving this behavior. every time they push that button, they're hoping to win. Every time they buy that lottery ticket, they're hoping to win. Every time they put money on a horse, they're hoping to win. We find that there's a key role of early gambling experiences in that pretty much every gambler we see, when we ask them about their early gambling experience, it's characterized by a win early on in their gambling. So even though they know they might not win, there's definitely this desire to end up at the end of a gambling session. And the possibility of losing, even though it's intellectually there, is sort of discounted when they're going to gamble. Pretty much all gamblers also exhibit erroneous beliefs about the likelihood of winning, as well as specifically about how gambling operates. Obviously there can be secondary motivators to gambling, but this sort of positive expectancy is really the driver of gambling problems. Now, this is why thinking about stimulant use in combination with gambling is really important. So stimulants, including both cocaine and amphetamines, have a variety of effects on the body. But the ones that are really important when we're talking about gambling are the following. So first of all, stimulants tend to increase a sense of self-confidence and make people feel what's called grandiose. They can also exhibit decreased sensitivity to punishment, hypersensitivity to reward, and decreased need of sleep. So these things sort of combine together. In a way, they're very similar to what we see in a manic episode. So it's almost like these drugs sort of induce a manic-like episode in people that use them. And it's almost like in priming someone to sort of go on to gamble. So if someone has increased confidence in their abilities and this sense of grandiosity, it leads to an inflated sense of their ability to win on their preferred form of gambling. Now, we especially see that in racing and wagering. So if someone is using amphetamines or cocaine, all of a sudden they think, I know everything about the horses, I know everything about sports, or I can see this, I can see that. And their confidence in their bets goes up, which in turn makes the size of their bets go up. Now, this sort of hypersensitivity to reward also increases the focus on the upside of gambling. And further minimizes the possibility of losing or ending down. So when someone is high on stimulant type drugs, it's almost as if, that sort of vague intellectual sense, oh, I know I could lose, but I hope I'm going to win. It's sort of, that's even completely out the window. It's just, the focus is just purely on that, I want to win, I want to win, I want to win. And that sort of decreased need of sleep and increase in energy also means that they have longer sessions than they would otherwise. These sort of, end sort of point of the sessions tend to sort of not come. So people will gamble for longer periods than they would see otherwise. But I put in red here down the bottom, it still requires the existence of erroneous beliefs about gambling. So someone who has never gambled before and takes cocaine or amphetamines isn't all of a sudden going to become a problem gambler. It's sort of in combination with that sort of that pathology that I described earlier, with that positive expectancy associated with gambling, is sort of a necessary precondition. And then once someone takes stimulant drugs, it almost sort of throws fuel on that fire. So let's look at the research. So there's very little research that's specific about gambling and stimulants in particular. So there is some research on gambling and drugs, quite a lot, but it tends to lump all drug use together, which can lead to an inflation of comorbidity rates. And the reason for that is pretty much every single gambler smokes. So I can tell you from working in this area for myself for 12 years, I can tell you what my office smells like after a day of back-to-back patients, because pretty much all of them smoke. And because nicotine dependence is then lumped in as a drug dependence problem, we see these incredibly high rates of co-occurrence of gambling and drugs, just because they're including people who smoke. But when we look at the research specifically on stimulants, there's a small number of studies. So Ethier and al. Published a study recently on community gamblers. And what they found was those who displayed problematic cocaine use were twice as likely to be problem gamblers. So of gamblers who use cocaine regularly, 70% had an apparent gambling problem. So that really shows that if you are a clinician working with stimulant drugs in particular, it's really important to ask about gambling, because it's often something that's not reported unless you ask about it, because there's a lot of shame and stigma around gambling. But there are these really high rates of co-occurrence when we are talking about stimulant use. So Geisner et al. Did a study a few years ago on college students, and it was quite a large study. So they had 4,000 students at baseline, of which they followed up 200 who were at risk, and they included all stimulants. And what they found was those who used stimulants had 3 times higher rates of problem gambling than the ones who didn't. But I think what's most important is at the 12-month follow-up, for those who already gambled, stimulant use predicted increased gambling at 12-month follow-up, whereas for those who didn't already gamble, stimulant use didn't predict gambling. So it really takes on what I said before, is that it is really, the pre-existing maladaptive beliefs about gambling have to be present, but once they're present, stimulant use is really going to, increase the gambling behavior. Now, a similar study was done with high school students in the US of 6,500 high school students. And what they did that was different as well is they looked at different stimulants. So the first study on college students sort of lumped all stimulants together. So it included things like, Ritalin and, prescription medication using without a prescription. Whereas this study specifically looked at which stimulants are the ones that are causing problems. And they found that, these prescription stimulants didn't seem to have a major impact on gambling, but things like crack cocaine and methamphetamines were related to extremely high rates of gambling problems. So what does that look like for us as a clinic? So what I would say is in the 12 years that I've been there, it's extremely rare to see someone who is presented with comorbid issues on opioid drugs. So I don't think that I've ever, in the time I've been there, we've never seen someone who has a comorbid current problem with heroin. We do occasionally see people with prescription opioid problems, but it's extremely rare. Cannabis use that we see in the gambling clinic is comparable to the general population, but it's rarely associated with gambling behavior. What I mean by that is people may say they smoke marijuana, but it's very rare that they're smoking marijuana while gambling at the same time. So it seems to be, if it is a problem, it's a separate problem to their gambling. And I think this really ties into this idea that there's something specific about stimulants it's not about risk taking generally. So it's not about drug use indicating that someone likes to take risks, which indicates that someone's likely to have a gambling problem. It's really that these stimulant drugs have these specific effects of, the increase in confidence, the decreased sensitivity to punishment, and increased reward seeking, that, it really fits with that model that it's that belief in being up that's really driving the behavior. So stimulant use is typically reported associated with gambling and with increased gambling severity. So people will say, when I'm using cocaine, when I'm using amphetamines, like my gambling goes through the roof. Like it's a very common presentation. And that includes people who may have recreational use of stimulants, as well as people who would have a diagnosable stimulant use problem. In the clinics that we see, the clients that we see, the gambling almost always predates the stimulant use. But we often have clients that present saying that they want to stop gambling, their gambling has caused them too many problems, but they don't want to stop using amphetamines or cocaine. They're like, yeah, I'm completely happy to use cocaine once a month or once a fortnight, but I just want to stop my gambling. So we have to have really careful conversations with these clients and basically say, well, we're a gambling clinic. It's not for us to tell you whether you should or shouldn't take drugs, but what we can say is, if you continue to use cocaine, if you continue to use ice, controlling your gambling is going to be extremely problematic. For those that have meet conditions where their stimulant use would be at sort of a, they would meet criteria for, dependence on stimulants, it's the only condition where we recommend seeking treatment prior to commencing gambling treatment. So for someone who's depressed or anxious, we generally recommend, come to gambling treatment, see if we can get your gambling under control. Generally speaking, because gambling is going to make anxiety or depression worse, so it makes sense to sort of nip the gambling in the bud before, working on their depression and anxiety. Whereas for stimulant use problems, we generally take the other approach, that it's really important to get your use of stimulants under control before we address the gambling, because as long as you're sort of using stimulants on a regular basis, it's going to be really hard to sort of regulate that gambling behavior because, you know, of those reasons I mentioned earlier, that it's going to be really hard to say no to those thoughts about gambling when you're sort of primed to sort of, you know, have that overconfidence and that focus in that being up. Okay, I guess that's the end of my prepared presentation. So I guess it's time to open up to questions.
Great, thank you, Dr. Hunt. That was really, really interesting. And I really enjoyed learning more about gambling and the underlying definition, particularly the echidna and porcupine analogy. Love a good animal analogy. I am aware that we did talk a little bit about depression and suicide today, so I just wanted to say that if the presentation has raised any concern for anyone today, there are a number of support services listed on Cracks in the Ice under the Get Support Now link, or you can call Lifeline on 13 11 14. Now, we do have a few minutes for questions, and some questions have already come through, but if there's anything that you would like to ask Dr. Hunt, I would encourage you to put them into the Q&A box now. So I'm going to just start off with, you mentioned there's quite a bit of stigma and shame around gambling, is that correct?
Yes, that's correct.
And that's quite similar for what we see for people who are seeking treatment for alcohol and other drugs. And I was just wondering what kind of the impacts of stigma and shame are in the treatment for gambling.
There's two main sort of impacts when we come into the treatment with the stigma and shame. So the first is the obvious one, that because of that stigma and shame, people can be very reluctant to put their hand up to get help. So we see that often it takes years before someone develops, after someone develops a gambling problem before they come in to see us. And usually it's only because they're being pushed in by someone they care about. So that's the first, it's a major barrier to people seeking treatment. The second is that people, as I mentioned, lying is incredibly common about their gambling. So people are reluctant to disclose to their friends and family members the extent of their gambling, which almost can make the problem worse, because if you sort of, I don't know, owe $5,000 on your credit card that has to be paid back tomorrow, but your wife doesn't know about your gambling, then it's almost like encourages you to give it one last shot as a way of paying back that debt, so that you know, your wife doesn't find out, your parents don't find out, your kids don't find out, your husband doesn't find out. And you know, when it comes to gambling, because there is uncertainty, like 9 times out of 10 that won't work, but 1 times out of 10 it does. So that sort of hiding things, and then as a result of that stigma, and then that leads to people trying to sort of do things without someone knowing, can sort of encourage them to keep going with their gambling, so to speak.
Yeah, that makes sense. And quite similar to what we see for crystal methamphetamine as well. People often put off seeking treatment for quite a long time because they're worried about what people will think of them.
Yeah.
So one of the other questions is there a correlation between drug or alcohol use with vulnerability to digital gambling behaviours? So e-casinos, in-app purchases and gambling apps. Do you know of any literature around that, or?
No, I think, first of all, I'd like to point out that like e-casinos are illegal in Australia. So despite the fact that they do get a lot of media attention when people use them, the actual rates of using e-casinos is extremely low in Australia. So of the people who gamble, which is at the moment about, the latest surveys in New South Wales say about 60% gamble within 1 year, less than 0.5% of those have ever tried an e-casino. So we're talking extremely low numbers of people actually use e-casinos. Some people, you know, I have clients myself who have used them and it has been problematic, but even with the lockdown, most internet gambling is not in e-casinos. It's in things like online horses and sports. So, you know, it does get a lot of headlines when there's a, you know, during the lockdown, spending at e-casinos, you know, went up 100 or 200%. It's because we're dealing with such small numbers that these big jumps can be seen. So I would hazard to guess that there isn't any specific research on it, because it is something that is very new and very, you know, a tiny number of people who are engaging in that behavior.
Okay, yeah. And in other digital gambling behaviors, has there been anything discussing drug and alcohol?
So with online, the thing is with online gambling on horses and sports, most people who bet on, so most online gambling that's done is done on horses and sports. And there doesn't actually seem to be many key differences between those who gamble online versus those who gamble in person. So even though some people will report that they feel different and they feel that it's sort of more immediate, and the only real key difference that research has shown between those who gamble primarily online and those who primarily go into the tab is that those who gamble online tend to be younger. But that's the only difference that research has shown between those two groups. So there doesn't appear to be any difference in the rates of drug or alcohol use.
That's really interesting, kind of surprising in a way.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of, I guess, sort of, you know, moral panic about the internet causing all these problems. But actually what we see is the same problems just done in a different space. So it's not to minimize the problems that people can have with these products. They can be extremely damaging. But, you know, so could the problems that people had going to the tab in years before. So it seems to be just a movement from the tab to online, as opposed to something inherently different that we're seeing.
Okay. And I've just got another question from Veronica. She was wondering, what does treatment look like for gambling disorders? Okay,
so the treatment that we have developed at Sydney Uni sort of essentially has three parts. So the first part, I guess, is helping a problem gambler understand how they got here. So it's about going through their early experiences with gambling, some of how their gambling's changed over time, to, I guess, help them understand their story about how they got to this place, you know, where they're in, you know, where they feel so controlled by gambling. The second part, I guess, is more about deconstructing some of the erroneous beliefs that they may have about their preferred form of gambling. And the third part is about putting that in the bigger picture, like helping them to use that new knowledge to be able to build a life worth living without gambling in it, and sort of taking a step back and seeing, you know, how gambling fits into the bigger picture and what they can do differently going forward.
Okay, yeah. Is there any correlation between, and this may be a difficult question to answer, but is there any correlation between the brain receptors that are stimulated through gambling and the brain receptors that are stimulated through stimulant use? Like, does it still go through the same dopamine reward pathway, or is it a bit different?
Look, the thing is about drugs is as you're probably more, you know, to be honest, actually my other major back in the day was pharmacology. So I do know a little, like, even for all stimulant drugs, each stimulant drug has a slightly different mechanism of action. So what cocaine does to the brain is slightly different to what amphetamines do to the brain. So, you know, in terms of what gambling does to the brain, it's even though, yes, dopamine is released, dopamine is essentially released anytime anything that's perceived as positive occurs. And the key difference with gambling is that there's not a substance that's being put into your body that is directly stimulating receptors. So it's not, it doesn't, I guess, have that same impact in that same way that stimulant or any other drug is going to have an impact. And the important thing about gambling is, you know, the release of dopamine is primarily influenced when, you know, those wins occur, or when a win is anticipated. So through, I guess, working with clients to help them reduce that anticipation of a win, is going to change that sort of release of those chemicals in the brain as well.
Okay, that's really interesting. Thank you. I'm glad that you also had a background in pharmacology. That probably made it a lot easier to answer that question. There's someone who's written in who'd like a little bit of clarification. So in terms of methamphetamine use and gambling, are there specific services that address both at the same time? Or is it mostly, as you mentioned in your talk, about addressing the substance use first and then the gambling?
I know there's generally, I know there's a preference for a lot of people to sort of have one service. There are some clinics that address both, but the problem I would generally say is the treatment for the two is quite different. So, you know, as I've gone through, I guess, our model of gambling, the focus is going to be very much on what we call the cognitive side. So it's very much about people's belief, understanding about themselves and about gambling that really needs to be tackled. Whereas the treatment for a substance problem, whether it's amphetamines or any other one, is going to have cognitive elements, but is going to have lots of the specific things they would target are going to be very different. And it would also have probably a lot more behavioral and medical elements that you wouldn't see in gambling treatment. So even though, yes, there are some services that do offer both, the treatments are quite different. So they do need to be addressed differently, I guess. It's sort of, if that makes sense. I don't know, does that sort of get at?
Yes. I think this might come back to the echidna porcupine thing, where they kind of look similar, but they have very different needs, if that would be.
Yeah, definitely. And I think, yeah, to use an analogy, it's sort of, you know, if someone has, you know, both, I don't know, diabetes and an alcohol problem, yes, they do tend to go together, but that doesn't mean that you give them the same treatment.
Yeah, that totally makes sense. Yeah. In terms of treatment approaches that you use at your clinic, is it mostly CBT, ACT, or other kind of treatments?
Yeah. So we mostly use a cognitive therapy. So the treatment that we use has less behavioral elements than other services, but we very much focus on the cognitive elements. Occasionally, with clients who are more complex, we also use elements of what's called DBT, dialectical behavior therapy. But the primary focus of what we do is very much on cognitive work with our clients.
And what is, if you don't mind me asking, DBT?
So DBT is a skills-based therapy that's it was originally developed for people with personality disorders, but it has been found to be useful for a wide range of presenting people, including there's a lot of research supporting its effectiveness with drug and alcohol problems. And the key components are mindfulness, developing interpersonal effectiveness, so improving your relationships with others, emotion regulation skills, and distress tolerance skills.
Okay, well, yeah. I can see how that would be quite beneficial and complementary to some of the other more cognitive treatments.
Yeah.
Are there any particular risk factors that might predispose someone to developing a gambling disorder?
The thing is about gambling disorders is, you know, we see pretty much people from every walk of life, from, you know, every background, every you know, income bracket, and with you know, a whole range of different psychological makeups as well. There are some factors which have been identified in the research as being overrepresented in gambling problems. So impulsivity as a personality characteristic is an obvious one that you would imagine. We also see you know, men are far more likely to have a gambling problem than women. People from lower socioeconomic backgrounds are more likely to have a gambling problem. And people from certain ethnic or cultural groups are more likely to have a gambling problem. So, you know, one of the highest risks are actually Anglo-Australians have one of the highest rates of problem gambling in the world. So, yeah, so there are particular groups. So being Australian actually puts you at risk of having a gambling problem in and of itself. So, but yeah, but that said, we do see clients that meet none of those criteria. So, yeah, so those things may make you more like. There doesn't seem to be any sort of personality traits. There's no gambling personality that we see. You see people from a whole variety of different personality types and traits.
Yeah, if you don't mind me following up with that,
yeah.
is when you say males are more likely than females, is there a particular reason behind that that's come up in the literature, or is it just one of those things that just come out?
It seems to be the main reason. So in poker machine clients, it's about 50-50. So there's no gender difference when we're talking about people that play poker machines. With wagering, it's almost exclusively male. So
Right.
on horses and sports. And it's believed to be more of a cultural thing than a sort of biological thing. That traditionally, I remember my grandmother used to send me down the road to pick my grandfather up to the tab because she wouldn't dream of walking into the tab. And I think, even now, if you went into a tab, there'd be very few women sort of standing around in a tab. It's a lot of it is cultural more than anything else, I think, because there is some anecdotal evidence that now that things are moving online, women are more likely to start engaging in sports betting, but it still is predominantly a male-dominated activity.
Okay, that's really interesting. I'm always interested in the differences between gender. Are there any online treatments for clients who might be reluctant to see a counsellor face-to-face, or those living in small communities?
Yeah, that is a watch this space. We have actually just got a research grant to develop and trial an online treatment. So it's not quite ready for testing yet, but watch this space. That's what we're working on right this moment.
Oh, that sounds very exciting. Just having a quick look. There's quite a few questions that have come in. Does your program also integrate any practical measures for financial stabilization?
We do offer sort of referrals to financial counselling services. So I guess with financial stabilization, I guess it's not quite sure specific, like as in, do we try and get gamblers to restrict their access to money, things like that, or is that what, I'm not quite sure what they're referring to, but yeah, we do provide access to financial counselling services that can help with debt payments and things like that. In terms of practical things to do with limits of money, it really depends on the client. So, each client is unique. For some people, for all clients, we really want the focus to be on the therapy, to focus on reducing the desire to gamble so that such things like that aren't necessary. But definitely when we're working with clients, and particularly clients who may be lower functioning or have, intellectual impairments or mental health issues, then sometimes, yes, we do put more, I guess, practical things in place, sort of as harm minimization.
Yeah, well, that leads nicely into my next question, because harm reduction is something that we often talk about in the alcohol and other drug area, and can help pick up some early problems. So is there anything sort of like harm reduction perspective in the gambling disorder world?
Yeah, I think probably the other sort of area that we're doing research in that is more sort of early education about gambling. But I guess what's different, traditionally that early education and the general general population education about gambling is very much focused on the harms caused by gambling. So, if you gamble, it can lead to this problems. And, but we find our research has shown that actually isn't very effective, that most people just sort of discount that sort of information. So, one of my colleagues has done research that instead focuses on providing informative information about this is how a poker machine works and this is how wagering works, which even for people who don't have a gambling problem, the greater majority of the population have all sorts of misconceptions about how gambling works, and that seems to be more effective at controlling later gambling behavior than this sort of harm focus, which has been traditionally what's been put out there.
Yeah, okay, so that's a little bit similar to what we see in the drug and alcohol field as well, about really recorrecting those misconceptions, particularly around crystal methamphetamine. Are there...
Yeah, I guess it's definitely analogous because it's just
Yeah.
sort of, I'm sure with drugs it was the same. It was, don't do drugs, or, that very sort of abstinence, or, these terrible things are going to happen to you. And it doesn't really work with young people.
No. Are there a lot of prevention programs or any of that about that are targeted towards?
No, and I think part of the problem that we've had with and the other sort of agencies that work with gambling have had is that because gambling, even though it's a serious problem, it does affect a smaller proportion of the population than do drug and alcohol problems. So in a very crowded curriculum, it's hard to sort of sneak it in, so to speak. So I think that's, I guess, so it's almost like just trying to raise awareness that this can be a problem. Is sort of the stage we're still at with gambling.
Right. Back to possibly your pharmacology days. For drugs and alcohol, we obviously know that genetics can play a role, and that for some people might be a little bit of a genetic risk factor. Is there anything like any research around that for gambling?
Yeah, there's no research that's shown any genetic risk factors for gambling. So yes, gambling does tend to run in families, but it's usually because it doesn't appear, from sort of adoption studies, they show it doesn't appear to be genetic. It more appears to be a learned thing, that if your parents gamble, you're more likely to be exposed to gambling earlier in your life and learn about it. And probably the reason why it's not genetic is, gambling by its nature requires the existence of money. And money has only existed for 2,000 to 3,000 years. So human genetics haven't evolved that fast, essentially. So I guess that when we're talking about drugs and alcohol and genetics, it's to do with, differences in brain receptors. Whereas with gambling, we're talking about a symbolic, essentially, activity. So it makes sense that they've never been able to find it, because it's an evolutionary scale. It's a recent behavior.
Yeah. I never thought of it like that, but that actually really makes sense. You touched a little bit on the sort of social dimension, because one of the questions that's come through is, are people more likely to use methamphetamine and gamble by themselves or with friends?
The thing is, this is what's interesting. Gambling is, I guess, different to a lot of drug issues, in that gambling is usually, when it becomes problematic, is usually done on its own. That when people have a serious gambling problem, they don't tend to play they might start off playing their pokies with friends, but by the time it becomes a problem, they're usually going on their own. With methamphetamines, not so much. We find that with the people that use methamphetamines, they might use methamphetamines in a social context and then sneak out to go gamble. What is different, though, is with cocaine use is, when someone uses cocaine, often there's this sort of, especially when we're talking about horses out or the casino, and you're out with a bunch of, usually it's other men, and it's about showing who can throw the biggest bet down, who can throw the most chips down on the table, who can put the biggest bet on a horse. So with cocaine use, we do tend to see this sort of social facilitation effect as well.
Yeah.
But with methamphetamines, I guess because of the different nature of how that drug is taken, it's more that, someone will use the drug in a social situation and then they'll sneak out to play the pokies or something like that. Does that make sense? Or?
Yes, it'd be interesting to understand a bit more about why, the differences between why some are used at the same time and some are used separately. And I think around that more stigmatized perception of crystal methamphetamine rather than...
and I think that's definitely it, because crystal meth, even though they're both stigmatized to an extent, cocaine use is stigmatized considerably less than methamphetamine use, and it's more likely to be done in a social situation. So I think that's probably why we see that in the gambling as well.
Yeah. Well, I've got 2 more questions for you if you think you can.
No problem.
So someone was wondering, would early exposure to gaming in youth lead to gambling?
That's the sort of $64,000 question. There's anecdotal evidence. There's not really any research on it because I guess gaming is still a relatively recent thing. So to be honest, I would just have to say I don't know. And I guess anyone that gives you a definitive answer to that question of that problem is going far beyond what the evidence is suggesting. But there's not really any clear evidence that really links gambling and gaming. However, there are some games that have gambling-like activities in them. So some role-playing games might have virtual casinos within the game, or you know, things like that, where someone can have that early positive experience of gambling within a gaming environment, and that can sort of lay the seeds for a later gambling problem. But there is, at this point, no, there isn't any clear research linking the two.
Yeah. And when you were talking about gaming, there was a mention of loot boxes in the one of the questions. And is that like one of those grey areas where gaming and gambling kind of cross over?
Yeah, so loot boxes, again, they're relatively, you know, they do attract a lot of attention, and they're a relatively new thing. But from, you know, as I said, from the thousands of clients that we've seen, these are issues that come up very occasionally. Like maybe, I think the loot box issue has come up with our clients once or twice out of the 5,000 clients we've seen, like maybe 2 or 3 have reported that that's how they got started. So I think sometimes, and I guess this comes back to the earlier question on the internet, is that a lot of the times these sort of newer, more exciting forms of gambling or gambling-like behavior attract a lot of attention. But we have to remember that still, by far, the greater majority of people with a gambling problem are gambling on pokies. So it's, and those that don't, the rest, the greater majority of them are betting on horses and sports. So yes, these things are emerging and they are potentially problematic, but the big problem is still the traditional forms of gambling. The pokies, the horses, the dogs, sports, and the casino.
Yeah, okay, well that's great to know, because we often see things in the media which can alter your, you know, reality of what you think is happening.
Yeah, and these things, they do occur from time to time, but they're I guess that's why they get media attention, because they are quite rare. So, yeah. You know, but the majority is still very much the poker machines.
Great. Well, I'd like to thank you so much for your really interesting presentation and for being so patient during the question time. I know I sort of gave you a little bit of an interrogation there, but yeah, it was really fascinating to hear about gambling and some of the links with stimulant use. And we really appreciate you sharing your insights with us today. I do apologise to anyone who didn't get their question answered, but you're more than welcome to send us an email and we'll respond to any questions or queries as soon as possible. So to all our attendees, we will be holding more webinars and putting new resources on Cracks in the Ice website throughout the year. So I would encourage you to subscribe to our mailing list at cracksintheice.org.au to receive any future updates. Now I'd like to finish the session by thanking Dr. Hunt enormously for his great presentation and for giving up some of his annual leave to present to us today. And I hope that everyone has a fabulous rest of the day.
No, thanks for having me. It's been a delight.
Great. Thank you. Bye.